So here we are in static.cpp. We're going to be working with static member functions and variables. So what we learned in our last video here. So to work with my static member functions and variables, I'm going to need a class. So I've created this class called static class, and it's got a constructor, function to increment our member number, output that member num, and then also a static member function as well. And we'll go ahead and get all that created here in our code. So we know constructors just follow the name of the class. So we'll just say static class. Okay, the idea of what the constructor is going to do is just going to set that internal variable to 0. Then what we also have is a function to increment. So it's going to be a void function. It's not going to return anything, but what it's going to do is increment our internal variable. So we'll just call it increment. We have another function to output, so we're just going to call that one output. It'll output that member variable. And then the last member function that I have here is going to be my static member function. So what it's going to do is going to get how many times we've done this whole count idea. So we're going to use the keyword static. It's going to be an integer. So it's going to return an int. It's going to be called get count invocation. So how many times did we count a certain thing throughout all of our classes? Remember, static variables count throughout all of our our objects of our class. So get count invocations will work with all objects of that class. So inside of private, what I need is my internal variable. So we're going to call that one num. And then also I'm going to have this static variable that's going to be shared with all objects of my count. It's going to be called count invocations. So we're going to count how many times a function is called. So we'll do that there as well. Notice I don't give it a value here, right? We never get our stuff values in private, but what we'll do is below main, we'll go ahead and give it what it needs to be. So here below main, and let's get some spacing here. First thing I want to do is assign our static member variable a value. So to do that, I say int, then I use the name of my class and then our static member variable count invocations, and I'm going to set it to 0. So this is kind of like doing what a constructor would do, but because static functions and static member variables work outside of a single object, right? They work for the whole class. So we can go ahead and do this here. It's kind of like a constructor for all static member functions and member variables. And then what I need to do is I want to start just writing the rest of my class member function. So we have static class here, and this is going to be our constructor. And our constructor is only going to set num underscore that internal variable to 0. Okay. The next thing I have is I have my increment function, so void static class for increment. Okay, and all this is going to do is it's going to increment that internal variable by 1. Now, the idea here is that I'm also, with my static member variable, counting how many times I call a function, no matter if I call it for one object or another object. So inside of this as well, I want to work on count invocations and increment that here as well. So this will get incremented, right? But this variable is a static variable, which means that it'll be shared throughout all of the instances of my class. So the third function that I have was called output. So let's go ahead and get output going here for us. And the output function will just output what the current value is. So the current value is, and then we'll output our num underscore and give it a new line here. Now once again, I'm trying to count every time that I call a function of my class. So let's go ahead and increment count invocations by 1 as well. Last thing I want to do is I want to write my static member function. So static class get count invocations. And then all I'm going to do here is just return that count invocations. Now, notice this static get count invocations was defined in our class as a static. Now, when I write it down below main or in my implementation file, we don't put the keyword static before it because we've already defined it as static when we declared it above. But remember also that since this is a static member function, it can only work with static member variables. So count invocations was a static member variable, so it can work with that. So now that I have my class set up with my static member variables and normal member variables, I want to go ahead and work in main with this class. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create some class objects, so a couple instances of my class. So I'll just call them 1 and 2. Now I want to output my count invocations. So currently we have called, so the idea is how many times have we called a member function. So we have called a member function. and then I can say how many times. Now remember, when I access a static member function, I use the name of the class and my scope resolution operator, and then the name of the function that I'm trying to use. So this will tell me how many times I've accessed a function in my class, because that's how I set it up to be. So what we know is that because that started at 0, this should output 0 for us. Now what I want to do is I want to call some member functions on object 1. So I'm going to increment object 1 by 1, and then I'm going to output that for us. Once again, I'm going to output count invocations and get an idea of how many times we've called a function. So let's go ahead and get that going here. I'm just going to copy my code. So once again, I'm just going to output how many times I've called a member function. So now I want to call some functions on object 2. So let's go ahead and increment that as well. We'll increment it again, and then we'll output it. And one last time, what I want to do is I want to output how many times I've counted the functions that I've run. So let's just run through this code in main before we actually run it. So the idea is I create two class objects, so 1 and 2, so 2 instances of my class. They have their own data, but what they share is our static member variable and a static member function. So the first thing I do is I output that static member function to tell me how many times we've gone into a function, and that started at 0. Now when I run one.increment and one.output, the value of num for the object 1 gets incremented by 1, so it goes 0 to 1. But at the same time, we told count invocations to be increased. So count invocations becomes 1. Now when I call one.output, that outputs the value 1 that was part of the 1 object, and it also increments that static count invocations to 2. Okay, and then we output this, how many times have we called a function, and that's going to output 2. Now I'm working on a different object, so I'm working on the 2 object. 2 gets incremented twice, so it goes from 0 to 1 and 1 to 2, and then I output it. Now every time I call a member function of an object, it also increments that static member variable. And because it's shared, it already was at 2, so now it becomes 3, 4, and 5. So when I output it at the end, it should output to 5. Now let's go ahead and build this and run it. What you see is I didn't call any member functions, and then I found that 1 had the current value of 1. Then I called the member function a couple times, right? And what I got was that 2 times. So this 1 came because I called 1 and I outputted, called the output function, so it became 2. Then I incremented the 2 object twice, and I output it, so 3 more times, which means that we've called a member function 5 times, right? So I've called 5 member functions, twice on the object 1, 3 times on the object 2. Remember, the static variable is shared throughout all of my class instances. So hopefully that gives you an idea of how static member variables and static member functions work. Remember, they're shared throughout all instances of a class, so you can use those values to get data kind of in a sense between your classes, because you're able to count or do other things based off of whatever instance of a class you've created, because they all share that static member variable or function. And that's all I have for this video.